Imagine you get a nuclear alert on your phone tonight. You know the sirens are real, you feel the tension, and you remember something you saw in an old documentary or on YouTube, a fallout shelter somewhere near your city, a place that promises safety underground. But is it still there? Would you really find the door unlocked? Or would you just find an old sign on the wall and a locked gate? Tonight we go beyond the myths and headlines to answer a question almost nobody talks about. Do public nuclear bunkers actually exist in America today? And would you really have a safe place to go if the worst happened? We are breaking down the reality of fallout shelters and public bunkers in the U.S., where they are, what happened to them, how to know if they are still usable, and what your real options are if you live in a city or state with no official shelter. Along the way, I'll show you how to check the status of bunkers in your area using official sources, reveal the truth about private solutions, and at the end, share the best resource I know for checking your risk zone in real time. Plus, if you have ever seen those viral maps or heard claims about a bunker for every American, you'll want to stick around because we are going to set the record straight. Let's really dig into the big question. Are public nuclear bunkers, those legendary fallout shelters, still a reality anywhere in America, or are they just ghosts from the Cold War? It's a question almost everyone asks at some point, especially if you grew up seeing those black and yellow civil defense signs on schools or city buildings. Or if you've watched documentaries showing families filing down into basement shelters in old black and white films. Back in the height of the Cold War, especially from the late 1950s through the 1970s, the United States government poured enormous resources into civil defense. The idea was simple but urgent. In the event of a nuclear strike, millions of Americans would need a place to survive, not just the initial blast, but the silent, invisible killer that would follow, nuclear fallout. Across the country, federal agencies led by what's now FEMA, but then called the Office of Civil Defense, worked with state and local officials to identify, mark, and supply fallout shelters. By the mid-1960s, over 100,000 structures, yes, 100,000, had been listed as official fallout shelters. You could find these in the most unlikely places: the dark basements of downtown skyscrapers, under city halls, inside post offices, even in the storage rooms of suburban schools or churches. Many were equipped, at least for a time, with barrels of water, boxes of high-calorie crackers, first aid supplies, and hand-crank ventilation fans. The goal was to provide at least 2 weeks of survival, the time scientists believed was needed for radiation levels outside to drop enough for people to emerge safely. There are still images in government archives and on the New York Times showing rows of survival biscuits and racks of steel drums covered in dust, abandoned for decades. If you walk around some old neighborhoods in cities like New York, Chicago, or Boston today, you might still spot those faded fallout shelter signs bolted to brick walls, silent reminders of a time when nuclear war felt terrifyingly close. But here's where history took a sharp turn, one that changed the landscape forever. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, the Cold War was ending, and with it came a massive shift in federal priorities. Funding for maintaining and stocking these public shelters was slashed or eliminated entirely. According to FEMA and the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, by the early 1990s, almost every city and state in America had stopped including public fallout shelters in their emergency plans. Local governments were told that the threat of all-out nuclear war was over, that the shelters were no longer a funding priority. Most cities quietly closed the shelters, removed them from maps, or repurposed them as storage rooms, archives, or even just empty, sealed-off spaces. NPR ran an investigative report as recently as 2022, confirming that the vast majority of old fallout shelters have not been inspected, stocked, or even unlocked in decades. The New York Times followed up with an in-depth article in 2023 showing that even in a place like Manhattan, once filled with shelter signs, almost none of those locations are maintained or safe for public use. Many were found filled with boxes, trash, broken furniture, or simply locked with no emergency plan. The few remaining operational sites, mostly in smaller towns or rural areas with a strong prepping culture, are a vanishing exception. not the rule. There's another layer of reality that most people miss. During the Cold War, the U.S. government never built enough shelter space for the whole population. Even at the peak of the program, studies published by the National Archives and the Federation of American Scientists show that, at best, only about half of the American population would have had access to a designated shelter, and that was only if they could reach it in time. The idea of a bunker for every American was always more of a hopeful myth than a guaranteed right. As the world changed and new threats replaced the old, the idea of maintaining public fallout shelters quietly disappeared from federal and state planning documents. FEMA, in its current nuclear preparedness guidelines, does not mention public shelters as a primary solution. Instead, Ready.gov and the American Red Cross advise people to shelter in place, choosing the most central, well-protected part of their home or workplace, and making the best use of whatever building they are in. So, to answer the big question, today, there is no longer a federal program that guarantees operational public fallout shelters for Americans. The old maps you see online, or in those viral Find Your Local Bunker videos, are almost always based on data that is 30, 40, or even 50 years out of date. Most of the sites listed have either been demolished, repurposed, or left to decay. The civil defense signs are often just historic artifacts, not promises of safety. According to every source I checked, FEMA, NPR, the New York Times, and local emergency management officials in several major cities. If you try to follow one of those signs in a real emergency today, you are far more likely to find a locked door, an empty room, or a pile of storage boxes than a stocked and operational fallout shelter. And yet, there are still a few exceptions, pockets of America where the tradition of community preparedness survives, or where local governments have kept certain shelters up to code for other reasons. But for most people, the reality is simple. Public fallout shelters are, for the most part, a thing of the past. Still, before you give up hope, let's look at where those rare exceptions might be, and what you can actually do to stay safe if there's no shelter anywhere near you. So are there any places where public shelters still exist and are actually usable? The honest answer is yes, but they are rare, and you have to know exactly where to look. In a few states, like Utah and parts of Texas, local governments or community groups have kept certain fallout shelters up to code, mainly because of strong prepping cultures or unique historical reasons. For example, Salt Lake City maintains a very limited list of publicly accessible shelters, as confirmed by the city's Office of Emergency Management as of July 2025, though most are designed for short-term sheltering during severe weather or tornadoes, not specifically for nuclear fallout. In Texas, some rural counties still maintain community shelters that could, in theory, provide some protection, but their effectiveness against radiation is not always guaranteed, and access can depend on local rules. Meanwhile, in New York City, the famous civil defense signs still hang on hundreds of buildings, but local reporting by the New York Daily News and interviews with city officials confirm that almost none of these sites have been maintained, stocked, or certified for decades. In fact, the last time the city published an official list was in the late 1980s. The same goes for most large urban centers. The sign may be there, but the shelter is not. For the most reliable information, FEMA recommends checking with your county's emergency management website or contacting your city's Office of Emergency Management directly. But even then, do not expect to find a working public bunker around the corner. Most Americans today live in areas where public shelters either do not exist or are not functional. If you have a tip or have personally seen a working shelter in your area, let me know in the comments, but remember, always verify with official sources, not just rumors. Given this reality, what can an ordinary person actually do? Private bunkers and shelters have seen a boom in interest, especially in recent years. Companies like Rising S and Vivos have reported record sales since 2022, offering everything from basic underground steel units to luxury complexes with air filtration, power generation, and food storage for months. But here's the catch. A true nuclear shelter that offers real protection from radiation, blast, and fallout costs tens of thousands of dollars, sometimes much more. The vast majority of Americans simply do not have access to a private bunker. Even so, some communities, especially in rural areas, have pooled resources to create shared shelters, and a growing number of preppers have built reinforced basements or safe rooms with thick earth, concrete, and ventilation. These can offer real protection if constructed to proper standards, which are detailed by FEMA and the Swiss Federal Office for Civil Protection. What about those viral videos claiming anyone can build a fallout shelter for a few $100s? Most of these are either misleading or dangerously incomplete. A proper fallout shelter needs careful engineering, solid materials, and a plan for ventilation, water, sanitation, and food. If you want to know more about realistic home sheltering, check out FEMA's Protection in Your Home Guidelines or the ready.gov resource library. And again, if you have a safe room or private shelter, share your setup and tips in the comments. Your experience could help someone else. What do you do if you live in a place with no shelter at all, public or private? This is the reality for most people. First, do not panic. FEMA and the American Red Cross both emphasize that almost any building is better than being outside during nuclear fallout. The best immediate option is to get as deep inside as possible, preferably in a basement or the center of a large, solid building, away from windows and exterior walls. Stack heavy materials like books, furniture, or even filled water containers between you and the outside walls to increase your protection. Seal gaps as much as possible to reduce the risk of radioactive dust. Stay put for at least 24 hours, or until you receive an official all clear message, because radiation drops sharply over the first day. Stock up in advance with water, food, a flashlight, batteries, a first aid kit, and a portable radio. These simple steps can make a real difference. The best resource for practical, step-by-step instructions is ready.gov's nuclear explosion page, which walks you through exactly what to do in the hours and days after an alert. Remember, even if you do not have a bunker, you can still survive if you know what to do and act quickly. Let's bust some of the biggest myths about public shelters and fallout bunkers in America. Myth number 1. Every city has a public shelter ready for use. As we've seen, this is no longer true. Most were abandoned decades ago, and only a handful are even partially maintained. Myth number 2. Those old civil defense signs mean a building is still safe. In most cases, the sign is just a leftover, and the shelter has not been stocked or inspected since the Cold War ended. Myth number 3. You can trust any map you find online. The reality is that many maps are based on data from the 1960s, or are created by enthusiasts, not by official agencies. FEMA and ready.gov both recommend double-checking with local emergency management and not relying on third-party websites, no matter how convincing they look. Myth number 4. You do not need to prepare if you do not have a bunker. The facts show the opposite. Having a plan for where to shelter at home, what supplies to keep, and how to get official information can save your life, even if no official shelter exists nearby. Do not fall for hype, clickbait, or YouTube experts who promise quick fixes. Stick to the sources used by real emergency planners, ready.gov, FEMA, the American Red Cross, and your city or county's Office of Emergency Management. So how ready do you feel after hearing the real story behind America's fallout shelters? Do you know where you would go in an emergency? Or is this the first time you've really thought about it? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you know of a real working shelter, public or private, let the community know. But always check with official sources first. For the best up-to-date map of shelter locations, I recommend using your local emergency management website or calling your county's emergency office, because information changes fast and only they can confirm what's real. If you want to go deeper on this topic, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. We are here to give you the facts, not the rumors.